بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين وبعد. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. Welcome back to another adult study circle. And tonight we're looking at, of course, Imam Bahuti's work, Umdatul Talib. We're going to pick up where we left off in the chapter entitled Imamship or Faslun fil Imama. Imam Bahuti rahimahullah ta'ala, he says, Al-awla bil-imamati al-aqra'u al-alimu fiqh salatihi thumma al-afqahu thumma al-asannu thumma al-ashrafu thumma al-atqa thumma man qara'a. Okay, so in this section of the textbook, this, what we would say, kind of beginner level manual, we're talking about the imam, the job of the imam, that's the imam for prayer, who is suitable to lead the prayer, and that will be followed with what the congregant needs to do regarding the imam. So we begin here with the imam and who is preferred. He says, Al-awla bil-imamati al-aqra. So what Imam Bahuti is giving us is the bare bones, and what we're going to add to it is a little bit more of the meat so that we can get a more well-rounded and robust understanding of the issue at hand. He says, it is preferred. So basically in the following order, we're going to look at the preference for the one who should be leading the prayer. The best reciter, who is most knowledgeable of the legal code. So it's al-aqra al-afqa. This is the preferred, that they serve as the imam. And this is based on a hadith. The Prophet ﷺ said the best in recitation should lead the people in prayer. This is collected by Imam Muslim and found in Musnad Imam Ahmad. So here, al-aqra al-afqa, so the best reciter and the most knowledgeable, it's a combination, a mix between the best of two worlds. The best recitation and the most knowledgeable of the legal code in general. So someone might ask, well, what about the scenario in which the Prophet ﷺ appointed Abu Bakr as-Siddiq to lead the prayer? Imam Ahmad radiallahu anhu actually had some commentary on this point. And he said that the Prophet ﷺ appointed Abu Bakr as-Siddiq to lead him in prayer with the rest of the companions in order to show them that he was deserving of being the imam in prayer and alluding to his suitability to be the imam in general, right, to lead the community, to be al-imam al-a'zam, if you will, that he would essentially take over as the head of state after the Prophet's passing, alayhi salatu wassalam. So that addresses the issue if there was some confusion as to, well, the Prophet ﷺ didn't always hold to this rule, but there was an exception because there was some need to do that. So, al-aqra al-afqa. They are followed by the best reciter, the best reciter who is a faqih. So it's al-aqra al-faqih. The best reciter who is a faqih, meaning they're knowledgeable of the legal code. They're not the most knowledgeable, but they are knowledgeable. Then the best reciter, who is the most knowledgeable of the prayer's rulings. So this is al-aqra al-alimu fiqh salatihi. The best reciter, who is the most knowledgeable of the prayer's rulings, even if they are not a faqih. They know fiqh as-salah, but they don't know al-fiqh entirely. And if all are equal in recitation, after that, the one who knows more Quran and is most knowledgeable. And they are followed by the one who knows more Quran and is a faqih. The best reciter here is given precedence. And a person may go, well, what about the person that knows more Quran, they memorized the Quran? Why are they not given priority here? So the best reciter is given priority over the one who knows more Quran because they have a greater reward. The one who is better in recitation has a greater reward than the one who has memorized more. And this is based on hadith which states whoever recites the Quran with accuracy, this is with bil-i'rab basically, will be rewarded tenfold for each letter, and whoever recited the Quran with mistakes, he makes lahan, will have one reward for each letter. This is collected in Sunnah Tirmidhi. So that shows you the priority there in terms of the preference in terms of reward, a person that recites more accurately, with accuracy, as opposed to a person that has memorized more. And that should help you understand what it means, the best reciter. The best recitation is the most accurate recitation. It doesn't mean the most melodious voice. If the person has a great voice, then that's great. There's something to be said about a person with a good voice because it can capture the attention and the hearts of the congregants. However, if they have a beautiful voice, but they're inaccurate and they make lahan, mistakes, they could potentially, I should say there are some negative outcomes for such a thing, especially when it comes to Al-Fatiha, which we'll talk about shortly. So that is what we're looking at when it comes to the best reciter, what that means over the one who has memorized more. It was also mentioned by Abu Bakr as-Siddiq and Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhum. They said, grammatical accuracy of the Quran is more beloved to us than memorizing some of its letters. Grammatical accuracy is more beloved to us than memorizing some of its letters. Okay? Then one who can recite, meaning one who has memorized what's needed for prayer and is the most knowledgeable. That comes next. Then one who can recite and is a faqih. So it's al-qari' al-afqah, and then al-qari' al-faqih. Then one who can recite and knows the fiqh of prayer. So it's al-qari' al-alimu fiqh salatihi, meaning he knows the fiqh of prayer, its pillars, its obligations, its recommendations, its invalidators, etc. And they are followed by one who can recite but does not know the fiqh of prayer. But they're able to perform prayer based on habit. So many people, you might ask them, what's the difference between a pillar and an obligation and a recommendation? And they may say, I have no idea. But I know how to pray because I've been praying for many years. They know how to perform their prayer. So they're still a valid imam. They can still serve as an imam even if they may not know the nuances and intricacies of those rulings of prayer. However, you are at the bottom of the rung when it comes to your preference, preferential choice. Okay? So that's another, it shows you the fadl of the virtue of knowledge, is that not only do you know things, but your preference, you're given preference and priority when it comes to leadership positions, especially when it comes to things like the prayer. Then after that, if all are equal in the lack of recitation, the most knowledgeable of the prayer's rulings. When the level of recitation and fiqh are equal, the eldest is to lead. So now we're leaving the kind of core standards of imamship. And if all of that is, if everyone's equal in that, then the eldest is to lead. And this is based on hadith, which states, when the prayer begins, one of you should make the adhan, and the eldest of you should lead prayer. It's muttafaqun alayh. It's also expected that the elder is more likely to achieve khushu'. And that the elder, it's more likely that their supplications are answered. Okay, then when all are equal in age, the most notable are to lead prayer. The most notable here at Ashraf is talking about Al-Qurashi. And from the Quraysh, the preferred of them is Banu Hashim. They're given priority over the general Qurashi. Banu Hashim, they're given priority. And this is based on the greater imamship. It's indicated in the hadith that the imams are from Quraysh. And the hadith, of course, is talking about Imam al-A'zam. But because they're given precedent for that, then they are as well for leading the prayer. They're followed by whoever migrated to the lands of Islam first. So the order of here goes Al-Ashraf, and then is Al-Aqdamu Hijratan. Okay? However, the order here is mentioned by Imam Buhuti in Sharh Muntaha. That's this book here that we have. He says, what seems to be obvious from Imam Ahmad is that the first to migrate is given priority over the eldest, according to what Imam Buhuti, rahimahullah ta'ala, mentions of Imam Ahmad. So you have a kind of one ordering here. This ordering that I mentioned originally is found in Hidayat al-Raghib by Ibn Qaid, which is kind of like our main point of reference. And then you have, Imam Buhuti himself explaining further in Sharh al-Muntaha. Just, to point out some differences that you might note if you're looking deeper into these textbooks. Then whoever embraced Islam first, and then the most pious, and this is based on verse number 13 of Surah Al-Hujurat, Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum. The most noble of you are with Allah are the most pious. Surah Al-Hujurat, this is verse number 13. So the ordering here, we have to understand the general objective of prayer, to know why the ordering is such, especially when it comes to the eldest and the most pious, the most scrupulous, the first one to embrace Islam, the first one to migrate. Meaning to migrate is the first one that answered the call to obedience first. You see, the first one to migrate, it means they answered the call to obedience first, beyond one who delayed or waited for whatever reason. So the objective of prayer is, number one, humility, al-khudu', it's obedience and surrender, and it's also hope that the prayer and the supplications that are made are accepted. Okay, so the most pious and the most scrupulous are more likely to have that happen. Al-atqa, al-awra', most scrupulous. The scrupulous person, al-wara', means someone that leaves the shubahat in obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the idea is to put somebody in front to lead the prayer so that the prayer will be accepted, because obviously the imam is yatahammal. He's gonna bear the burden of the prayer of those that are behind him in many regards, and then he's going to be making supplications in that prayer. And so the hope is that those supplications are answered, and you want to put the most suitable person in that place to do so. This point is extremely important to remember later on when we talk about who is not a valid imam, so you understand kind of why for some of these things. It says, and then if all are equal, when there's a need, the winner of a lot casting, okay, which is based on qiyas of the adhan. So if everything's equal, recitations, their knowledge, their age, their hijrah, all of these things which would give them priority are equal. If there's a need, meaning no one's going to relinquish their right to lead, then they draw lots, much like you would do for the adhan. If two people were kind of arguing over who gets called the adhan, then they're going to draw lots, and whoever wins, they are to lead the prayer. He says, وَصَاحِبُ الْبَيْتِ وَإِمَامُ الْمَسْجِدِ أَحَقُ وَحُرٌّ وَمُقِيمٌ وَبَصِيرٌ أَوْلَى مِنْ ضِدِّهِمْ. So here, he says the homeowner, and we're talking about one who is suitable to be an imam. You could be a homeowner, but you're not suitable to lead prayer. Maybe you don't know Al-Fatiha, for example. Or there are a number of other reasons why you shouldn't be leading prayer. The homeowner who is suitable to be the imam has more right to lead, even if they are a bondservant, more right than their guest. And this is based on hadith. The Prophet ﷺ said a man is not to be led in his own home. And this applies to the imam of the masjid, the imam who has been appointed and is also suitable, even if they be a bondservant. Both of these, the homeowner and the imam, is known as Imam al-Ratib, they have more right to lead the prayer. This is the case even if someone more knowledgeable or capable is present. Even if someone who is aqra wa athqa is there, the owner of the house and the imam of the masjid has more right to do so. Though, some say, it seems feasible that they allow the more virtuous or the more capable to lead prayer. Basically, they give permission and invite them to lead the prayer. However, if they didn't, they would be maintaining their right, and there would be nothing wrong in doing that. So this concept of the imam and the owner of the house having more right, an example of this can be found in the life of Ibn Umar when he visited a masjid in which there was a servant that was appointed to lead prayer on the land which he owned. Ibn Umar prayed with him. They then asked if he would lead them in prayer, and he refused. And he said, the leader of the masjid has more right. And this is collected by Imam al-Bayhaqi. There's also another hadith which states, whoever visits a people is not to lead them, but a man from them should lead them. And this is found in Sunan Abi Dawud. Another kind of reasoning behind this is that taking the imam's place is an avenue to thinking ill of him or having people think ill of him, which may drive the people away from that imam. He's been appointed, he's there, that's his position. And if you're jumping in his way and taking over, then people may assume, well, he's doing that because something's wrong with the guy. And it can create a negative outcome. This general rule or principle here is the case unless the leader or the ruler is present. In that case, he is given precedence to lead prayer in the masjid or another's home. And this is based on the Prophet leading Itban and Anas in prayer in their own homes. Okay, the next part, he says, the free man, resident, and sighted are all preferred over their opposites. So the opposite of a free man would be a slave or a bondservant. A resident, the opposite would be a traveler. The sighted person, the opposite would be someone who's blind. So these three, freedman, resident, and sighted person, they all are given precedent over their opposites. And there's some reasoning behind that. The freeman is preferred because he is more noble and whole. To be free is to be ashraf. Akmal, right? You're free, so you can come and go without anybody's permission or need for leave. The leadership of a bondservant is not disliked. They can lead the prayer, except when it comes for Jum'ah and Eid. There are some stipulations that we'll discuss when we get to those chapters. The resident is preferred over a traveler who is shortening and combining prayers because it's likely, meaning they're traveling the distance of shortening the prayer because it's likely that they will shorten prayer as the imam, which will result in the residents missing some of the prayer in congregation. After the imam prays rak'atayn, for example, for dhuhr, everyone else is going to have to stand up and pray on their own, which means they would have prayed half the prayer in congregation and the other half they would have prayed by themselves. So they would have missed out on some of the virtue of congregational prayer. It is, however, not disliked for a traveler to lead a resident in prayer when they shorten prayer. So the issue of shortening prayer during travel is mustahab. It's preferred that you shorten prayer during travel. Combining prayer is jaiz. It's allowable. There's a difference to understand between the two. One is preferred, one is allowed. So if you happen to be the imam, if they complete the prayer, the traveler, it's disliked because they have abandoned what is mustahab. It's preferred that they shorten the prayer. The sighted person is preferred over the blind because they're more capable of avoiding impurity. They can see impurities, and they're more capable of facing the qibla because they can see the direction. Another note would be the townsman preferred over the countryman. So the townsman is al-hadari, and the countryman is al-badawi. So al-hadari, this is typically because the countrymen, the Badawi, are considered a little bit more rough and harsh and less acquainted with the limits of the rules of prayer. You find this in the Quran when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is in Surah At-Tawbah, Allah says, وَأَجْدَرُوا أَلَّا يَعْلَمُ حُدُودَ مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ عَلَى رَسُولِهِ. Surah At-Tawbah, verse number 97, talks about the Bedouins, al-Arab. All right, we skip some of the verse. In the middle it says, and more likely not to know the limits of what the laws of Allah have been revealed to His Messenger, alayhi salatu wassalam. So that's in general. And also that the Bedouin, the countrymen, they typically live in remote areas. They have limited access to people who can teach them the limits of these rules regarding prayer. Some more preferences. The one who has wudu is preferred over the one who purified themselves by way of tayammum. It's preferred here, by the way. This is not an obligation. These are preferences. It's preferred because water-based purification removes a hadith, whereas tayammum only permits prayer. It's yubih as-salah. It doesn't remove the hadith. One who's lending a house is preferred over the one who it is lent to in the event that they're in the same house. I lent you my guest house, and then I go to that guest house to see you, and it's time for prayer. I, who was lending the house, have more right to lead that prayer because I own that house. That's my space, and you're just utilizing it, okay? This is different from one who's renting a house. If the landlord comes over and is there, what do you think? The landlord owns the property, but as the renter, you have تملك المنفعة, because you're entered into a contract of rental agreement. You own the usage of that property for that duration. And so in that case, the renter has more right to lead in the rental property than the landlord. They're preferred. The renter owns the benefit of that rented space during the duration of their contract, and therefore they have right to lead prayer. Leading one who is preferred in prayer, this is important here, leading someone who is preferred to lead prayer. Meaning, this, like we mentioned here, these are their preferences. So you're going to lead them in prayer, meaning they should be, it's preferred they lead prayer, but you're going to lead them prayer. It's disliked to do so unless they give you consent. Leading the imam of a masjid or the owner of the house is impermissible. So one is makruh and one is haram. It's haram without their consent. And it's important to note that al-hurma fil ibadat taqtadi al-fasad, which means that when it comes to impermissible things for ibadah, it necessitates fasad, which is to invalidate a thing. You commit something haram in an act of worship, it means it's going to be invalidated. And that leads us to the next point that Imam Buhuti says, وَلَا تَصِحُّ. It's not valid. خَلْفَ فَاسِقٍ وَلَا امْرَأَةٍ وَخُنْثَى لِرَجُلٍ ولا صبيا لبالغ ولا أخرس ولا عاجز عن ركن أو شرط إلا بمثله سوى إمام الحي المرجو زوال مرضه ويصلون وراءه جلوس الندبة وإن ابتدأ بهم قائما وعجز فجلس فأتموا خلفه قياما ولا خلف محدث أو نجس يعلم ذلك فإن جهل مع مأموم حتى انقضت صحت لمأموم. Okay. He says, وَلَا تَصِحُّ خَلْفَ فَاسِقٍ, meaning the prayer is not valid behind a fasiq. A fasiq imam. So we're going to talk about this briefly. Okay, so we understand fisq. Fisq is like inobedience, it's disobedience, it's sin. And this type of fisq includes doctrinal. It's fisq al-i'tiqad. You have a deviant belief, like Rafidi or Mu'tazili or Jahmi, one of these major deviant sects. The fisq is doctrinal in nature, or is based on fisq al-amali, which is the deeds that are done, like impermissible speech or action. Again, prayer is about obedience, submission, and hope that it will be accepted and the supplications, that the dua are answered. You want the most suitable person leading that. And a person who is a fasiq, whether it's i'tiqadi or amali, doctrinal in nature or by way of actions, they're not suitable for this position. And this is the case regardless if it is made public or kept private. This is based on a verse in the Quran, أَفَمَنْ كَانَ مُؤْمِنًا كَمَنْ كَانَ فَاسِقًا لَا يَسْتَوُونَ. Is the believer like the fasiq? They are not alike. This is Surah Sajdah, verse number 18. There's another hadith that's also we can use as evidence for this. The Prophet ﷺ says a woman is not to lead a man. A Bedouin is not to lead an immigrant. And a fasiq is not to lead a believer unless forced by the sultan, whose whip and sword are feared. It is, however, valid behind their just representative. A fasiq is also not to lead another fasiq in prayer. So You may understand that in some cases, a person that's not suitable to lead the average person in prayer may lead people of their category in prayer. If they have trouble pronouncing certain words, they may not be suitable to lead people that are capable, but they can lead people that are in the same kind of boat that they're in. But here, for the fasiq, they're not even eligible to lead another fasiq in prayer. It should be noted that prayer behind a fasiq must be made up, except for Jummah and Eid, if it's not possible to pray behind someone else. So like if the ruler, the leader, has taken up the position to lead those prayers, which was traditional back in the day, and there was no other alternative for Jummah or Eid, then you can pray behind them and your prayer is accepted. Any other prayer, you would have to make it up. It says if they fear harm, they pray behind them and make it up. It's also not valid for a man to be led in prayer behind a woman. Okay, we stop for a minute here. I want to bring something to your attention here. Okay, the nature of this book is as I've mentioned before, it's kind of a beginner level book. It's a beginner level manual. And the way that this is mentioned, if you just listen to it, it's not valid for a man behind a woman. It's mentioned like it's requisite knowledge. There's no great explanation. There's no presentation of evidence. There's no argumentation of why or reasoning, etc. It's just stated plainly like that because this concept is known in Islam. It's obvious in Islam. There has never been this huge emotional debate in Islam. There is only a debate and a conversation about such a topic when the Muslim Ummah drifts away from the orthodox tradition and scholarship of the Ummah. They become unfamiliar with their legal code and they become distant from orthodoxy. Then you'll find there's room to start arguing and talking about, can a woman lead men in prayer? And you'll find that there are congregations that start with this as one of their primary missions, is to put a woman in the leadership of prayer. But here Imam Buhuti simply states, for a man to be led in prayer behind a woman, or a hermaphrodite. Hermaphrodite, of course, is not a trans person. Hermaphrodite is a person that their actual, biological gender is yet to be determined. It's not someone that has a determined gender and then wants to reassign themselves another gender. That is not the case at all. Okay? That is a different scenario altogether. A person that does not know their gender because they have both organs, and one is not obvious over the other, then they could be male, they could be female. This is not like someone who was once male and has undergone gender reassignment surgery and is now acting as a female, or a female who has undergone reassignment surgery and is now presenting as a male. This is not the same thing. I would go out on a limb to say, if a person, this is key, if it was a biological female who is now presenting as a male, then we would say, it doesn't matter what you're presenting as, what matters is what you biologically are. So your leadership in prayer is not valid for men. Or if it was a biological male presenting as a female who wanted to lead the congregation in prayer, because it was very progressive, then we would say, do you believe what you're doing is okay? Because this could be fisq. It could be worse than that if they do it knowingly and say this is halal, because this is changing Allah's creation. It could be worse than that if they deem this to be permissible. So that we would say, sorry, it's not valid. And this is obvious. It's known in Islam. It's not something new. It's not something we need to debate. It's clear. So, it's not valid for a man to be led in prayer behind a woman or hermaphrodite. It's also not valid for a woman to lead a hermaphrodite in prayer. The hermaphrodite could potentially be a male. This is like a hermaphrodite leading a man. Or another hermaphrodite. The hermaphrodite could be a female leading a man in that case, because it's unknown. Or the hermaphrodite leading another, it could be that the one leading is a woman and the one that's being led is a male. Right? And this is based on the hadith which states a woman is not to lead a man in prayer. This is a hadith, Ibn Majah. A woman is not to lead a man in prayer. There is no difference in this regard in the prayer, whether the prayer is obligatory or voluntary. Therefore, if a man were to pray behind either a woman or hermaphrodite, not knowing their gender, and then find out, he would be required to repeat the prayer. You would be required to repeat the prayer if you then found out the gender. Now, there's one exception to this. And this is a view that's held by, as mentioned by the great Imams, أكثر المتقدمين. أكثر المتقدمين. This is the early era, if you will. They viewed that it was permissible for a woman or hermaphrodite to lead men in Taraweeh prayer if she was a reciter and all of the men were incapable of reading. They could not read. And this is based on a narration from Waraqah, who said, O Messenger of Allah, I memorized the Quran, but none of my family does. And he said, have the men stand in front of you, and you stand and pray behind them. So this is the exception. And this is held by al-mutaqaddimin, which means later, down the line, they said, not even for this. So you'll find that there is some mention of this, and the reasoning is because, the lack of ability of the men to do so. Could not read. Meaning, it doesn't mean they weren't memorizers of the Quran. It means they couldn't read Al-Fatiha. They weren't capable of leading the prayer. Even if it meant just leading the minimum of the prayer, they couldn't even do that. Then in that case, the Prophet ﷺ gave them this permission to do so. Moving on to the next kind of topic. He says, obligatory prayer is also not valid for the pubescent behind the prepubescent discerning youth. Meaning that you cannot be the imam while you are mumayyiz, غير بالغ. Even you're mumayyiz, which means you're like between 7 and puberty. Between 7 and puberty, you cannot lead baligh. You can't lead a pubescent male. And this is based on the statement of Ibn Mas'ud. He says, the young boy is not to lead until penalties are enforced upon him. This is collected by Al-Athram and Imdad al-Hadi. And there's nothing that's been narrated to contradict this report. There's nothing to say otherwise. The imam is also liable. We talked about this before. He says, al-imam dhamin. The Prophet ﷺ says, al-imam dhamin. The imam is liable. Whereas the sabi, who's pre-puberty, they're not liable, right? They're not mukallaf. They have no moral, legal capacity. Until they reach puberty, they're not of legal capacity. And so, they're not going to lead a baligh in prayer. And that is for the obligatory prayers. Because somebody who's a mumayyiz can lead a grown man in voluntary prayers, like Taraweeh, for example. Or they can lead other youth in obligatory prayers. If there's going to be a congregation of young kids, they're all between 7 and 10, 11, 12, whatever, then they can certainly lead in those obligatory congregational prayers. And of course, them praying an obligatory prayer for them is considered a voluntary prayer because they're not obliged to do so yet. It's also not valid behind someone who is mute, meaning they can't speak. even if the congregation is also mute. And that's because they cannot recite. They cannot fulfill the requirement of recitation in an alternative manner, like someone that could sit down as opposed to stand up. The same applies to someone incapable of performing a pillar, like bowing or prostrating or fulfilling a prerequisite like facing the Qibla, unless those behind them are also incapable. And this is similar to someone who cannot maintain purity during prayer due to a constant hadith, like incontinence. Or if somebody has a wound that won't stop bleeding or leaking. Their prayer is only valid for them out of necessity. It's not valid that they serve as an imam. They can certainly follow the prayer or pray by themselves, and this is it's sahih li-darura. And it wouldn't be valid for anyone else unless they're suffering from the same challenges, the same things. It's also not valid for someone who cannot stand in an obligatory prayer unless none can stand, except for the local imam, expected to heal, in which case it is recommended for those behind him to pray seated. So if your imam is suffering from a temporary challenge of standing, whether there's an injury or something, he's unable to stand, and it's expected he'll recover. Right? The prognosis is, might take you a couple days, you'll be back on your feet, no problem. In that case, the congregation can pray behind the imam, he's seated, and they're seated. If the diagnosis is, sorry, that's it, there's no more standing, you can't stand anymore, then that imam has to be excused from his post so that someone can stand in his place and fulfill that pillar of prayer. So at that point, that would be retirement of the imam. But if he is expected to recover, then the congregation can pray behind him while seated, even if they possess the ability to stand. And this is based on a hadith of Aisha radiallahu anha. She said that the Prophet ﷺ prayed in his house while suffering from illness, and so he prayed while seated. He prayed while seated. Others prayed behind him while standing, and so he gestured to them to sit. He was praying while seated, and he gestured to them to sit down. When he was finished, he said the imam was made to be followed. Till he said, if he prays while seated, then all should pray while seated. And this hadith is muttafaqun alayh. It is, however, to pray behind the seated imam standing. It's valid if you were to stand up. He says, if he, meaning the imam, began leading prayer with them in the congregants while he was standing, and then he sat during prayer due to incapacity, they are obliged to complete it standing. So if you began standing, you have to complete it standing, even if the imam loses his ability to stand during that prayer. And this is based on the Prophet ﷺ praying seated during the sickness which led up to his death, and Abu Bakr as-Siddiq and the others prayed behind him while standing. Prayer is not valid behind one who knowingly is impure by way of either a major or minor hadith or najis on the body, clothing, or location unless overlooked. If, however, the imam is unaware of that, they're unaware of the hadith or najis, with the congregant also unaware of such a state until the prayer concludes, it is only valid for the congregant. Because they were unaware, the congregant's prayer is still intact. And this is based on a hadith which states, if one in a state of sexual impurity prays with the people, he is to repeat the prayer while their prayer is complete. Meaning they didn't know about it. There's a condition which was mentioned, which was stated by Ibn Qunduz. He said, this is the case so long as the congregant recited Al-Fatiha. And we talked about reciting Al-Fatiha being a recommendation, according to the madhab, for everyone in prayer, even the ones standing behind the imam. And they are to recite the Fatiha fi sakatat al-imam, when he pauses and is quiet. This is because the imam will shoulder this responsibility so long as they are a suitable imam to lead prayer. But in the event that they have hadith, they're not in a state of purity, or there's najis on their clothing, or etc., then they're not actually in a position to be leading prayer. So what's understood from this is that if the imam or some of the congregation knew before the prayer or came to know during the prayer, all would be required to repeat the prayer. Right? The difference is whether the imam knew and the congregation knew of such a state. He says, وَلَا إِمَامَةُ مَنْ لَا يُحْسِنُ الْفَاتِحَةِ أو يدغم ما لا يدغم أو يبدل حرفا بآخر غير ضاد المغضوب ولا الضالين ضاء أو يلحن فيها لحنا يحيل المعنى إلا بمثله وإن قدر على إصلاحه لم تصح صلاته. He says imamship is not valid for someone that does not know Al-Fatiha. They have not committed it to memory. They do not know Al-Fatiha. Or who renders, they make a idgham. It's called a diphthong, which is not to be rendered as such. And this example would be like joining the ha in Allah with the ra in Rabb. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. So if you join those two together, Illahi Rabbil Alameen, that is not valid. Or they replace one letter with another. If you replace a letter with another, there's an exception, and that is a dad in the word maghdubi and ad-dali. If you replace the letter, the dad, with a dha, it's still valid because they're unable to pronounce the letter correctly. If you cannot pronounce the letter dad, but you say it dha, maghdubi alayhim wala dhalin, because you can't say a dha, the dad, the prayer is still, the imam's position is still valid. If you changed it to a za, for example, maghzubi wala dhalin, no. You shouldn't be leading people that can recite it correctly, but you could lead people that cannot, that are in the same condition that you're in. This level of incapacity does not render them incapable, and their leadership is valid, meaning if you made that error of dad versus dha. And this is the case even if they know the difference in the letters and the meanings, whether they know it or not. Or one who solicizes, which means they make lahan in a way which changes the meaning. And a lahan here is like putting a fatha on, this is lahan jali. There's two types, lahan khafi and lahan jali, which is like the minor mistake and the major mistake. So the major mistake would be putting a fatha on ihdina, to say ahdina. Ahdina means gift us. Instead of ihdina, which means talab al-hidayah, which means guide us. So if you say ahdina, you change the meaning. Right? It's funny to think. Ahdina as-sirat al-mustaqim. Gift us the straight way, as opposed to guide us the straight way. Or to put a kasra on iyaka. If you say iyaki na'budu wa iyaki nasta'in, that means you've changed it from masculine to feminine. Or if you put a dhamma on an'amtu, right? Then you made it the first person form of the verb, as opposed to an'amta. You said an'amtu. That means you've made it me, I have blessed or bestowed. Unless you're leading people of a similar condition, meaning everyone else makes those mistakes behind you, then you can lead them in prayer. But if there's one person that can recite that properly, then you are not permitted to be leading the prayer. Anyone that makes these types of mistakes, this person is known as al-ummi. Ummi. Ummi is a reference to the al-umm means the mother. And it's as if they were born from their mother, meaning they were born in this state where they could not do these things. Okay? This is also the case, meaning the imamship is invalid for one who is only capable of reading the first half of Al-Fatiha correctly when leading someone who can only read the second half of Al-Fatiha correctly. They can read the first half, but they can't read the second half. So they shouldn't be leading someone that can read the second half, but can't read the first half. Understand? Or vice versa. The person that can only read the second half correctly shouldn't be leading the person that can read the first half correctly. Those two would need to pray alone. Yeah, if they were leading prayer, there's only two of them, then they would pray alone. If the person, the imam, makes any of the previously mentioned mistakes on purpose and can correct himself but does not, his prayer is not valid because he's no longer reading the Quran. إِيَّاكِ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكِ نَسْتَعِينُ. That's not the Quran. أَهْدِنَا الصِّرَاطَ الْمُسْتَقِيمِ. So if you're reading Al-Fatiha, for example, you're the imam and you're reading Al-Fatiha and you make a mistake in Al-Fatiha, you have to go back and repeat to correct yourself. And this happens. There's nothing wrong with it happening so long as it's fixed. So long as it's fixed. Like if you are reading and you get stuck on a letter, like it doesn't come out. Saqf lisan. Right? You have a what do they call? Tongue. You become tongue-tied in the prayer. And it just doesn't come out. Not that you were intentionally reading it wrongly, it just happens. Then what do? You have to put it in reverse, back it up, and then start again so that it is produced correctly. You can't just go, oh, hada saqt lisan, khalas mashayna. Right? I made a little slip of the tongue, we're just going to keep it going. I don't want to go back. People might say, why is he going back? What's this? What's happening? No, for Al-Fatiha only, you have to go back. Anything else after that, balash. So if you do make these mistakes appear, then on purpose, while you can correct them, the prayer is not valid, right? It's no longer reading the Quran. If you do so believing it's permissible to make such changes, this is kufr. All right, we're almost finished with our session for tonight. He says, وَأَقْطَعِ يَدَيْنِ أو رجلين أو إحداهما أو أنف وأن يؤم أجنبية فأكثر لا رجل معهن أو قوما أكثرهم يكرهه بحق ويصح اتمام من يقضي صلاة بمؤديها وعكسه لا مفترض بمتنفل ولا ظهر خلف نحو عصر. It's also disliked for a man to lead one or more strange women. This is ajnabiyya, meaning they're not min al-maharim. These are women that you're permitted to marry. It's disliked for a man to lead one or more strange women who are not in the company of a man. And this is because the Prophet ﷺ prohibited a man from being alone with a strange woman. Doing so results in al-wiswas, right? You want to stay away from al-wiswas. These are like the whispers. If there's another man present or his mahram is there, mahrama is there, it would not be disliked. If such a prayer led to them being alone, like in private, al-khulwa, it would be impermissible to do so. Leading prayer is also disliked for a group of whom the majority rightfully do not like the imam. The majority of them do not like the imam. Then the imam should not lead. He's not allowed to lead the prayer. As long as they don't like him for a reason, like a justifiable reason, like there's deficiency in his faith or his religiosity. There's deficiency in his dignity. So if there's some reason why they wouldn't want him to lead the prayer, they don't like him because of some justifiable reason, then it's disliked for him to lead the prayer. And this is based on a hadith which states there are 3 people whose prayer does not pass beyond earshot. A runaway slave till he returns, a woman with whom her husband is displeased throughout the night, and an imam whose people do not like him. This is found in Sunnah Tirmidhi. If they do not like him, but it's unjustified, then his leading is not disliked. It's perfectly valid. So there has to be some justifiable reason. And I think this is important when it comes to like selection of your imam or letting an imam go. Okay? This is key. I think this is kind of like should be considered part of the kind of framework of masajid when it comes to how they treat imams. Because sometimes what I've heard stories of is, normally masajid here are organized by boards of trustees or board of directors or some like supervisor body or something like that make decisions of hiring and firing, etc. Sometimes it may be that 1 or 2 of the board members do not like the imam for personal reasons, Maybe it's not, if it's justifiable, then khair, okay, we might have an argument. Maybe he's not suitable, there's something that he doesn't want to disclose to the community, something has happened, and therefore you can terminate the position. You don't want to expose the deficiency. Maybe that's best to keep that under wraps. But if there's a personal issue where it's not a justifiable excuse to terminate, then maybe you need to be looking like, does the congregation like the guy? Looks like 85, 90% of the people like the guy. He's a great guy then. If it's, hey look, most of the people here just don't like the guy for some reason. He's been around long enough and people have gotten to know he's really not that great of a person, then we now need to make a decision. Even if you are a board member who makes decisions and you love the guy, because he says everything that you like him to say, most of the congregants don't like him, then you have to make a decision and say, time to go. It says it is valid for someone making up a prayer to be led by another offering it on time. Someone making up dhuhr, for example, praying behind someone making it on time, or vice versa. Someone praying it on time behind an imam who is making it up. This is justified because the prayer is the same prayer as dhuhr. The only thing that is different is the time. One is adat and one is qada'in. But it's still dhuhr prayer. So the intention is still there. But it's not valid to be led in an obligatory prayer by one making a voluntary prayer. Someone praying dhuhr behind someone who is offering a 4 rak'ah voluntary prayer. It's like someone praying isha behind someone leading tarawih. It's not valid to be led in an obligatory prayer by one making a voluntary prayer. This is based on a hadith which states, and do not differ from him, meaning the imam. Do not differ from the imam. And because the prayer of the follower is different than that of the one leading, the follower has differed. The imam is leading tarawih, you're praying isha. So you're praying a different prayer than the imam is praying. The main difference here is in the intention made for the prayer, unless it's obviously like tarawih and Salat al-Isha. Tarawih is rak'atayn and Salat al-Isha is 4. It's also not valid to be led in dhuhr behind someone leading another prayer like asr. Again, they're leading asr prayer and you're praying dhuhr. These are two different prayers. And so you cannot be led in such a prayer like that. It's not valid. It is, however, valid for one to pray a voluntary prayer behind someone leading an obligatory prayer. So someone that's praying dhuhr and a person comes and prays a voluntary prayer with them, following after them, because the general nature of their intention is the same. They're intending at-taqarrub, which is piety. They're intending salah. The only difference is ziyadatun niyyah fil imam. The imam, his niyyah, is there's a ziyadah, there's a little bit extra, which is ta'yin al-fard. The one who's praying a nafilah, that's not there. But it's not a different prayer. He's not saying a different ta'yin fard akhar or ta'yin something else. It doesn't change. The foundation is still there. So in that case, it's permissible. Because the congregant following has not opposed that intention, there's nothing to prevent it. There's also a hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ said, after seeing someone pray alone, is there any man who will offer charity and pray with him? It's found in Sunan Abi Dawud. You understand the difference between the two cases? One is praying an obligatory prayer. One is praying a nafilah prayer. One is being led, or one is praying a nafilah prayer being led by someone praying an obligatory prayer, versus someone who's leading a nafilah prayer being led by and leading someone praying an obligatory prayer. All right, so if you come in for Ramadan and the imam is now started in Taraweeh, you cannot pray your Salat al-Isha and then stand up and complete it while he's praying Taraweeh. What you have to do is pray Salat al-Isha and then join the Taraweeh. Like that. And that's where we'll conclude. Jazakallah khair. Appreciate your patience and attentive listening. Jazakallah khair. Wa sallallahu alayhi wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad.